events coming up.
Yeah.
We've held teach-ins on the Communist Manifesto, Greed and Capitalism, the assassination of Fred Hampton. These have all been great events. They've been well attended. We've had great discussions. We're looking forward to more.
Yeah.
On October 20th, there's going to be a teach-in at 5:15. That's this Thursday on the politics of student debt, the need for a radical debt movement. So come out to that, especially.
Yeah.
Is that in conflict with the march?
I'm not sure.
They typically take place at 5.
All right, well, this is on the schedule for 5:15, so I assume it's going to happen then. And then on October 23rd, that's this Sunday, we've got to talk on gender capitalism.
All right.
Yeah.
A couple more announcements to make before I introduce our speaker. I just want to, for those of you who have never been to a teach-in, I just want to go over a couple of issues of format, how this is going to run. So our speaker, Keeanga, is going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. And after she talks, we're going to have a discussion. And we want the discussion to be as open and organic as possible. So don't feel like you need to direct questions exclusively to Keeanga. We want to get everybody talking and talking to each other. The way that we're going to have people talk is we're going to do it in stacks, like in the General Assembly. For those of you who don't know what stack is, there are going to be 2 people on each side of the group here taking stack. One of them is James. Raise your hand, James. He's in this sweet white getup over here. Can I get another volunteer to take stack over here? Alright, this is Ashley. Raise your hand high, Ashley. So if you wanna speak, get on the stack. They'll take your name down, and then you'll speak in order, the order in which your name was taken down. Try to keep. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, say.
There's a last-minute scheduled teach-in that will be tomorrow at 3 p.m. Professor Bill Ayers will be coming to give a teach-in on nonviolent direct action.
Nice. Yeah, right. Yeah. Thanks, Bill.
Oh yeah, thanks, James. You can find this schedule on the website. Go to the little events tab and look for educational events, and there's a very, very full schedule there. There's a list of past events with descriptions as well.
What's the website?
OccupyChai.org.
I know.
And there's video going up. I'm not sure if it's on the website yet, but it's going up. Look on the website for info about that. So anyways, if you want to speak, get in the chat. Please try to keep your comments to about a minute so that we can get as many people to speak as possible. And please try to keep them to the point. We want as many people to speak as want to speak, but we also want to make sure that everybody who wants to gets a chance. So it's really important that you keep your comments about a minute and to the point.
See how long that lasts.
Yeah.
Somebody want to keep time too? That'd be great. Anybody with like a watch? Thank you. All right. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Keeanga Taylor, coming to us from Northwestern's Department of African American Studies, and she's here to give what I'm sure will be a very, very stimulating talk about racism in Chicago. Here she is.
Yeah.
Yeah, Keeanga.
How's everyone? I'm going to sort of weave in discussion about racism in Chicago with a more sort of general picture of racism in the United States right now. Just to begin with, I think clearly the Occupy movement has connected with workers, poor people, students, all of the dispossessed really from across the globe because of its emphasis on the gross inequality that has been produced and perpetuated by capitalism's market economy. The movement has articulated this inequality brilliantly by pointing out how it is the 1% who live and thrive off the exploitation and impoverishment of the rest of the 99%. But in the United States, we should be clear, and what many of us should know, is that life in this country is impacted not only by economic inequality, but racial inequality as well. There are examples of this racial inequality that surround us all around the city, all around the country, but the most profound example came just 4 days after Occupy Wall Street began in New York, when the state of Georgia coldly and calculatedly executed an African-American man, Troy Davis, who most of us believe to have been innocent. The murder of Troy Davis ripped the illusion of democracy right off of this sham society in the same way that the Occupy movement has exposed the lie of democracy that is completely corrupted by corporate profits and the rich. By showing that even if you're innocent, if you are poor or working class and African American in Georgia, you can be put to death regardless. And what both of those show, coming within 4 days of each other, is that people like Troy Davis and the millions of us who have been protesting around the globe have no voice in this corrupt political system. But that racism is at the heart of this system means that all too often African Americans and Latinos in particular have even less voice. Often economic and racial inequality overlap with each other. And this is plain to see in the current economic crisis, where white unemployment is at 8% in this country, but black unemployment is double that at 16%.
Yep.
19% of all African American men are unemployed, and 46% of African American youth aged 16 to 24 are unemployed. But in the inner cities across this country, this unemployment is even more severe and pronounced. On the south side of Chicago, it is estimated that black male unemployment is more than 40%. Someplace like the segregated ghettos of Milwaukee, black unemployment is as high in the country as anywhere else at 45%, so on and so forth. The so-called experts in both government and in the press alike like to claim that black unemployment is so high because there are things like skills mismatches, that African Americans just don't have the same kinds of education, and that's why they are disproportionately unemployed. But this is just a way of denying that it's racism that is really at the heart of growing black joblessness.
That's right.
The University of Chicago did a study a few years ago that showed if you have a black-sounding name like mine, Keeanga, you are twice as unlikely to be called back for a job, even if you have the exact same resume as a white person with a white-sounding name. Northwestern University did a study showing that a white male with a felony record was twice as likely to be called back for a job than a black man with no record at all. Moreover, among white college graduates, unemployment is 4%, but for African American college graduates, presumably with the same skill level or at least a similar skill set, the unemployment is 9%. So this kind of job discrimination explains, in part, well, it shows, one, that racism is institutionalized and not just a question of the individual attitudes of this or that employer, but that it is systemic to the system itself. But it also explains why African Americans are more likely to be working class or disproportionately poor. More than 25% of black children live in poverty in this country. Chicago has the highest level of black poverty in the entire United States, with 33% of black people in this city living below the official poverty line, which we all should know is officially too high in the first place.
That's right.
In the entire country, 25% of black people live under the federal poverty line. So what that means in real life is that when Congress and the White House, both Republican Congress, Democratic White House, dither about the number of budget cuts that they're going to undertake, the number of social programs that they're going to cut. When Rahm Emanuel talks about the need to cut the budget and starts with the social programs, we have to understand that the impact of those budget cuts will fall heaviest on the poorest and most working class communities, which are all too often black and Latino. And it's not only budget cuts, but when Rahm Emanuel in this city and the Democrats and the Republicans and the national government decide that they want to target public sector unions, we have to understand that public sector unions disproportionately represent black workers in particular.
That's right.
When they are talking about downsizing the Federal Postal Service, we have to understand that 20% of postal workers in this country are black.
Yep.
When they are talking about, in this city, going after the Chicago Teachers Union, 30% of Chicago public teachers are African American. So we shouldn't let that discussion fall into abstraction when they talk about needing to cut back on the public sector. What they are really making an argument for is that black workers should be poorer, should deal with less health care, and have less rights in the workplace. Really basically ignoring the reasons why people formed unions in the first place. And it's not only unemployment that has led to this deeper impoverishment of black communities. It's also, in this city in particular, we have to look at the collapse of the housing market.
Yep.
The housing crisis in black America is one of the clearest indictments of the banking industry. For much of the last century, discrimination against African Americans by the banking industry, which was allowed and cultivated by the federal government, meant that it was very difficult, if not impossible, for many black people to buy their own homes. But by the 1990s, with the white housing market almost completely saturated and no one else to sell to, the real estate industry and banks turned to black communities as a new market to push homes onto. Except now that they were going to peddle home ownership at the same time that the banking industry and mortgage lenders were becoming increasingly less regulated, which was exemplified best by the complete unregulated monitoring of mortgage lending institutions, which were created by banks as spin-offs because banks are regulated by the federal government, but mortgage lenders were not. These mortgage lenders not only targeted black communities for home ownership, but they also targeted black communities for expensive and predatory subprime loans. These were risky loans with higher fees, higher interest rates, and adjustable mortgage rates that would increase 2 or 3 or 4 years after they were initially made, which meant that you could buy a house with an interest rate of 3%. 4 years later, that would balloon to 12 or 13%, meaning that your mortgage was no longer affordable. African Americans with credit scores the same or as good as whites white people who received prime loans were steered to subprime loans instead. So in a city like Chicago, the Chicago Reporter did a study that showed if you were black with a 6-figure income, you were more likely to be steered into a subprime loan than a white person making $35,000 a year. That is plain and blatant discrimination. Chicago was ground zero for subprime loan scams. If you were black in Chicago, you were more likely than anywhere else in the country to be sold a subprime loan. More than 50% of all black homeowners who bought houses in 2005 were given subprime loans. And this is why the foreclosure crisis across black Chicago has been so devastating. In communities like Inglewood and on the west side of Chicago, there are blocks with 3 or 4 foreclosures on them, which is completely devastating for the community as a whole, but it also means that if you are unfortunate enough to have a house on a block with 3 or 4 foreclosures, it means that now your house is worth absolutely nothing.
That's right.
In 2008, 65% of all foreclosures in this city were in minority-majority census tracts. So in majority black and Latino neighborhoods, this is where all of the foreclosures are happening. What is also insidious is that in working class and poor African American communities, banks that have foreclosed on properties have decided that because those houses will never be worth what they were originally sold for, they would just rather walk away from them. So instead of even having people live in them, having them rented, they refuse to have people living them and basically walk away from the properties themselves, meaning that those properties are now abandoned, and abandoned properties increase the likelihood of blight. They become attractions for crime, so on and so forth, and they also have a negative impact on whatever is left standing in those neighborhoods. But the foreclosure crisis is not just for homeowners, but also the vast majority of small buildings housing 6 or fewer units that have gone into foreclosure are in black and Latino communities, creating not only a crisis for small working class landlords, but also creating a crisis of eviction in those areas as well. One study has shown that black women account for 40% of the evictions in inner cities across this country. And of course, the final piece to the housing crisis in Chicago is the absolute destruction of public housing in this city. For years, the federal government and local authorities allowed public housing buildings and units to go into disrepair, refusing to fix them so that they could use that as the legitimacy for getting rid of them in the first place. And Chicago has succeeded in that, in getting rid of most of its public housing over the last 15 years, which has exacerbated the movement of working class African Americans out of the city. People should know, in the last 10 years, more than 180,000 black people have left the city of Chicago, not for the suburbs, but out of the area completely. And so the combination of unemployment, the attacks on public services, and the workers who perform those jobs and the housing crisis should put African American and Latino workers at the center of the Occupy movement.
That's right.
In 1966, Reverend Martin Luther King left the movement in the South to come to the North to demonstrate that racism in the United States was not just a regional affliction, but was a phenomenon that existed across the entire country. In August of that year, King addressed more than 50,000 people in Chicago Soldier Field, just a few blocks from here, to outline what the Chicago freedom movement should look like. In his speech, he said, quote, "This day we must declare our Emancipation Proclamation. This day we must commit ourselves to make any sacrifice necessary to change Chicago. This day we must decide to fill up the jails of Chicago if necessary in order to end the slums. This day we must continue our already successful efforts to organize in every area of Chicago unions to end slums. Together we must withhold rent from landlords that force us to live in subhuman conditions. And let me say here and now that we are not going to tolerate moves that are now being made in subtle manners to intimidate, harass, and penalize black landlords who may own one or two buildings while ignoring the fact that slums are really perpetuated by the huge real estate agencies, mortgage and banking institutes, the city, state, and federal government."
That's right.
After that speech, more than 35,000 Chicagoans, most of them black, marched to City Hall, where King nailed a list of demands related to housing, education, and jobs on the front door of City Hall.
Hell yeah.
Part of the Chicago Freedom Movement's goal is to highlight the unequal living conditions in African American communities created by the existence of slum conditions. And I would say that that should be a part of our goals today
Hell
as
yeah.
well. The challenge for our movement today is how to make it more representative of those who are being exploited and oppressed in American society. How do we make our movement more multiracial and reflective of the concerns that grip working class black and Latino communities? And that means understanding that racial inequality is not just about economic inequality, but it also means taking up social justice issues like police brutality in the black community, the racism in the criminal justice system, the racist death penalty, the attack on undocumented immigrants and those who, quote, look like them, the attack on Arabs and Muslims in this country and in this city and around the city, and also the attacks on public education in Chicago when we know that public schools in this city are 98% black and Latino. We have to take up these issues because we will never have economic justice without racial justice in this country.
That's right.
Because the central way the 1% hold on to their power is by using racism to divide the 99%. And the way that we achieve the unity that we need to fight the 1% will be by taking up both the economic and social questions that impact all of Chicago, but particularly black and brown Chicago. Last thing. Finally, there are some who have raised questions as to whether or not our movement is diverse enough. And so, of course, we always need to bring more people of color, blacks, Latinos into our movement. But we can't judge a movement by where it begins. Rather, we have to, as participants of the movement, argue about the way forward on what we believe will make the movement stronger and more representative. And it is impossible to win that argument standing on the outside or the periphery. We have to be involved.
That's right.
We have to be at the center of it, making arguments about what is going to make our movement the strongest in this city and around the country. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.